can answer yes to any of these statements. Because if you can, then I think you're broaching the ability to be able to wait. Question number one. How many of you, when you are rushing out the door, you're already a little late? You have to get somewhere quickly. Just love to stand and wait and watch a toddler put on their snowsuit. You can almost feel just the frustration beginning to build. How many of you, when you go to the grocery store, don't look to the express lane, don't look to the quickest lane, but you look and see who is the teller in training? Who is the person that is inevitably going to go into their purse and pull out 15,000 coupons to price check? Who is the person that has absolutely the most stuff? What is the longest line? Because I just love to wait. How many of you, when someone shows up late for coffee or lunch or dinner, and they show up 20 minutes late, and they come in and they're panicked and they're apologetic, they have excuses, you say, no. I want to thank you because life is too rushed. And I just appreciated the 20 minutes of me time that I got. To just kind of pause and to wait and to reflect. Any takers? Here's the kicker. How many of you consider a great Friday night jumping on the 403 at about, 5 o'clock and heading into Toronto and saying, I can't wait to hit Hamilton, and then there's Burlington, and then there's Oakville, and then there's wonderful Mississauga. I just can't wait to sit in traffic. Because we love to wait, don't we? Or maybe not. Think of so many things in our lives. Think of so many inventions and technology in this world. They all push us towards accomplishing things quicker, to not having to wait. I was thinking just this past week, and maybe there is something, but have we invented anything that actually enables us to wait, that actually enables us to slow down, that is actually less efficient in doing something? Would anyone want that? I mean, think of some of the basic things that we do all the time. Communication. It started when we wanted to communicate to someone and we couldn't have the face-to-face, we wrote letters. Well, then we invented the telephone. So we don't have to write a letter, we can call them and talk about it quickly. Well, then we invented the internet and we had email. So I don't need to write you, I don't need to call you, I can email you. Well, then we invented texting. Then we invented Instagram. And now we come to a place where when we send a text, when we send an email, when we send an Instagram post, we expect people to respond, to like, to comment immediately. Because we don't like to wait. Think about food. I'm sure we all like good food. But we've created things to not produce good food, to produce fast food. I mean, one of my favorite things to eat is pizza. I love going out for pizza. But now if I don't want to wait, I can order in pizza and it can be delivered to me. And now we've even invented a thing called pizza pockets. Does anyone honestly think that that is a good idea? But it's quick. And if you're hungry and you're in a hurry, you don't want to wait. So why bother eating good food? I don't think we like to wait, do we? But the question this morning is, how does this all work into our relationship with God? How does waiting play out in the midst of faith? Karen made reference to it this morning in talking about the library. We're entering into a season called Advent. And I'm sure we're all familiar with Christmas and what we celebrate at Christmas, but Advent may be a little less familiar. Advent is a tradition of the Christian church, that season before Christmas, that has been developed as a time of waiting. A time of building a sense of expectation as we wait upon what we celebrate at Christmas. But do we like to wait? Do we like to wait on others? Do we like to wait upon ourselves? But ultimately, do we want to wait upon God? Do we want to wait for him? I thought it was rather ironic because this was actually the message I was going to give last week. And clearly I needed to wait a little bit longer. And so the freezing rain came. I'll own that one. You can blame it on me. But we don't like to wait. And perhaps you found yourself in a situation, maybe you're in a season here today where you're waiting on God. And to be honest, you're not too pleased about it. Maybe there's a prayer that you have prayed. Maybe there's a desire that you wish would be answered. Maybe it's related to finances. Maybe it's related to work. Maybe there's a health concern. Maybe someone is sick. Maybe it goes on and on and on. But you are waiting upon God. And you come and you hear these promises of God being with us and God responding to us. But we wait and we wait and we wait and nothing seems to happen. And so how do we respond when we are forced to wait upon God? Do we worry? Do we start to make wrong assumptions when we don't have the full picture? Do we start to think, well, I'm going to take action? That I've asked God, I've waited upon God, and God, if you're not going to deliver on this in this amount of time frame, then I'm going the other way. It's almost as if at times our prayers are kind of like a microwave, right? We want to throw it in, we want to set the time, we want to push, and we're willing to wait for a moment, a day, a week. But God, if you don't deliver, what does it mean? But how many of us actually allow waiting to build a sense of anticipation? It's what the writers in the Bible refer to as hope. Hope is that which is given that you've not yet experienced in your life. Hope has the precondition of waiting. And so if we take a step back and we begin to ask ourselves the question, do we want to find hope in God? I think the question that comes back at us on the flip side is, are we willing to wait? This morning we read a couple of passages from the Bible. There are actually three different places, the prophet Micah, the prophet Isaiah, and then the Apostle Paul's writing to the Christians, the Galatian Christians. And they all focus around the same event. Yet two of them are looking towards the event, and the third one is looking back upon it. Now, Micah and Isaiah, they are Old Testament prophets. And you see prophets appear numerous times throughout the Bible because they were used by God, oftentimes not only simply to speak about that which was yet to come, but to remind the people to remain faithful in the midst of life. Now, Micah and Isaiah, they were relative contemporaries. They were separated by about 40 years. Now, that might not seem so contemporary to us, but in the context of the entire Bible, they're relatively close. And they're writing around the same situation, that basically the nation of Israel, God's people, are going through an incredibly difficult time. That things are not going according to plan. And they have looked back in their history and they've seen other times when things haven't gone according to plan and that God has shown up and that God has delivered. And they're sitting around wondering, God, why not us? When are you going to respond? And in both instances, Micah and Isaiah speak of the greatest promise of the Old Testament. And that is the promise of the coming Messiah. Isaiah used those words, wonderful counselor, our Prince of Peace. This wonderful promise that God had not forgotten them, that God was putting in place the Messiah, the one who would come and save Israel, the one who would come and restore Israel, the one who would come and make everything right. This wonderful promise that Micah first spoke about. But it's a promise that came, and then the people needed to wait. Not a day, not a month, not a year. 40 years. 40 years. That's more than a generation. Imagine a promise that was given to you that you had not yet seen fulfilled when your kids came along and started to grow up. Well, then Isaiah comes onto the scene. And again, Isaiah offers these very same words to the people. That God has not forgotten you. That there is this wonderful Messiah that is coming. The one who's going to bring peace. The one who's going to redeem Israel. The one who's going to be the hope of the world. And so they waited again. I don't know if in front of you have a Bible, but if you don't have a Bible, grab one of those blue Bibles in front of you and turn to page 890. 890. That's the prophet Malachi. He is the last prophet in the Old Testament. He is the last one through whom God would speak. And the distance between Malachi and Isaiah in years is 300 years. Micah spoke, the people waited 40 years. Isaiah spoke, the people waited another 300 years, and the Messiah had still not yet come. Do you think people worried? Do you think people jumped to conclusions? Do you think people started to walk away? Do you think many people lived with a sense of hope? Well, the very final words of the prophet Malachi are words of promise, words again of the coming Messiah. But it had been 300 years. Put your finger in that page and flip probably a couple pages, and you'll land on a more familiar book, the book of Matthew. Guess who shows up in the book of Matthew? The Messiah, the Savior of the world. Now we can flip through our pages, but essentially it's one page. Do you know how many years separated the end of Malachi to the beginning of Matthew? 400 years. So those of you doing math in your head, we're looking at over 700 years of waiting. Of waiting upon a promise that God was going to give to his people. A promise that ultimately was not fulfilled until the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. 700 and more years after it was first spoken about in the Old Testament. Now, why am I telling you this? Because I think in the midst of life, we need to be reminded that waiting is a part of God's plan. Do you know over 43 times in the Old Testament, God tells his people to wait upon him? 43 times. Clearly, this is not the only story in the Bible where people needed to wait upon God. There's story after story, encounter after encounter, where God gives a promise, and it takes time before God responds to what is happening. And so the question maybe is not, do we have to wait? But rather, why do we wait? Why can't God be more like a microwave and just kind of deliver in the quickest, most appropriate time? I appreciate the words of John Ortberg as he says this, that what God does in us while we wait is as important as what we are waiting for. Have you ever considered that? That what God does in us while we wait is as important as what we're waiting for. It speaks to the reality of this incredible process. It speaks to the reality of there are times that often we are waiting and God is working and revealing in our lives in the midst of the waiting, in the midst of the wanting, in the midst of the wishing that God would respond. So I think the question for us is not, is God asking us to wait? But rather, how? How do we wait in the midst of life? How do we wait in the midst of those situations where we just ask and pray that God would reveal something as to what we should do? As we're waiting upon that test result to come back. As we're waiting upon wondering if we'd have that job down the road. As we're waiting upon a relationship that has seemingly gone off the tracks. And we ask and we ask and we ask, how do we wait? How do we wait in such a way so that our first response is not that of worry? Worrying that perhaps God has stepped away. Worrying that perhaps God will never respond. Worrying that perhaps this is all just a total waste of time. How do we not land in that place? How do we not allow our worry to begin to draw wrong conclusions about God and about ourselves? Because maybe in our waiting, sometimes we start to draw wrong conclusions about God. That God doesn't actually really care. That God isn't actually going to work. That God doesn't actually love me. How do we wait in such a way that that does not become a part of our internal dialogue? Or that we don't begin to make wrong conclusions about ourselves. That God hasn't responded because I'm really not worth his time. Or because, we talk about forgiveness, but God surely can't forgive my past. Or we worry because God is not going to use someone like me. How do we not allow that to become a part of our conversation? Or how do we wait in such a way that when God doesn't respond, our response is eventually to say, I am going to walk away. I am just going to figure this out on my own. Because God, if you're not stepping in this, then what is the point in any of this anyways? How do we wait in such a way that we allow hope to begin to build? That we allow the soil of waiting to begin to produce an incredible sense of expectation and understanding. That even though we may not understand it, even though we may not appreciate it, we will continue to wait and hope upon the Lord. I want to suggest two things. The first one is one of the greatest instructions that God often gives to us. A reminder I think we all need. And it's one word. Remember. Remember. Often what God tells his people in the moment of waiting is to remember what I have done. Remember the promises that I have given. I'm just going to throw up on the screens the last passage we read here this morning. It comes from the book of Galatians. It comes at the Apostle Paul, who's looking back decades later after the birth of Jesus, and this is the reminder he gives to the church. He says, but when the time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive the full rights of sons. The phrase that comes back, but when the time had fully come, God. One of the ways that we're able to wait is that we remember that God is in control. That God has a plan. The timing may not be what we want it to be, but that doesn't mean that the curtain has dropped and that the scene is over. I'm sure many of you have gone to a play or gone to a theater, and the first opening act begins, and then the curtain closes. And we all know that you don't get up and leave because they're doing things behind the scenes, things that you don't know exactly what they're doing, but you wait with a sense of anticipation for the curtain to go up again. If you showed up to the theater and you just simply went to the first act and the curtain closed and you walked out the door and people said, so how was the production? How was the show? I'd be like, it's kind of lousy actually. Well, did you stay to the end? And that is the key. Oftentimes in our moments of waiting, we need to remember that even though the curtain has gone down, God is not inactive. He is working behind the scenes, and that curtain is going to rise again and grant us incredible hope. And so how do we remember? I think in big ways and in personal ways. The big ways is spending time reading the Bible. Don't read the Bible because you feel you have to. Don't read the Bible because the guy up front with a mic tells you it's a good idea. Read the Bible because this is one of the best ways that we can remember. Not only what God has done, but what God has promised to do. Great reminder. But then we also need to do it in personal ways. To remember that God is at work in our own lives. One of the disciplines that I've gotten into, shouldn't even call it a discipline, it's something I do on occasion, is just write things down. Sometimes it's in my Bible, sometimes it's in a notebook, and I write down the things that I struggle with, the things that I wish God would respond to more quickly. And what it starts to do is two things. One is it creates for me an opportunity to actually have a conversation with God about this, to start to write down the things that I'm struggling with, the things that I'm waiting for. But the other thing it does is I can go back to it later, and I can see the way in which God worked in those situations. Not always responding how I thought he should initially, but the thought in which he would later on. And what I start to see is not only what God did in the situation, but ultimately what God has done in me. So write it down. Allow it to build hope. The second thing is not only to remember, but to remember the worst thing you can do when waiting is to do it alone. When you're waiting for something, simply having someone else with you can make such a tremendous difference. And that's why God has wired us for community. He's wired us not to live this life on our own, but so that when we're in those places, in those moments of having to wait, having to wonder, when we have other people to come around us and to support us and to encourage us and to remind us, it enables us to continue to find hope when we may not have wanted to do it on our own. And so being here is a first great step. But it's also why we talk so much about our small groups, about living life together. And you may be thinking, that's a big jump for me. But what is your next step? Maybe it's coming to one of the events in the bulletin of just getting to know some other people, beginning to recognize, how can I do life together? And so that in the midst of my waiting, I'm not doing it alone. I have people to come around me to encourage me and to support me. I don't disagree. Sometimes I wish God would be more like a microwave. Microwaves are fast. Microwaves are efficient. But I find food that is really worth eating doesn't come out of this. And even more is true about God. As hard as it is, so often the greatest gift that God gives to us is in waiting. Is in waiting to see what he's going to do in us and through us. We've got this amazing Advent calendar here. And each Sunday we're going to open up different doors to reveal gifts that God wants to give to all of us. Some of you are going to be able to participate with this in the coming weeks. to really highlight these themes of Advent. So this Sunday, we're going to open box number 8 and see the gift that God wants to give to us. It's the gift of time. Now, this is old school. Half of us in the room don't even know how to use this one. But maybe this week, whatever you tell time with, whether it's one of these, I don't have my phone on me, but whether it's one of those, can you use it as a reminder to remember that God is with you, that God has not walked away from you, that God has given you the gift of his presence even in the moment of waiting. So will you wait upon him and find strength in him? And so together in a moment, we're going to celebrate communion. And maybe this is something new and this seems somewhat unusual as to why we do this. But this is an opportunity for us to come together and to remember again, not only what God has done, but ultimately what God is going to continue to do through the Messiah, the one the prophets spoke about in Isaiah and in Micah and in Malachi, the one that Paul reminded the faithful followers of Jesus about, the one we celebrate every day of our lives in this place. The hope of the world, the Prince of Peace, Jesus Christ, our Messiah. And so I'm going to invite you. We're going to sing a song in a moment. The musicians can come and join me up here. But as we prepare for communion, I want you to take something that maybe you're waiting upon God for and allow it to simply be given back to him. And ask, God, may you strengthen me in my waiting. Because waiting is a gift that's given to us by God. Let's stand and sing.